Cool. Okay, in which case we can start. Hi everyone, and welcome to the week 10 and the last for this term workshop that we are doing. Today we're going to be talking about hypothetical motions, so all the motions that start with assuming the technology exists, but also a bunch others about pills and supernatural phenomena and all those nice things. So if I can get the next slide. So the first thing that we want to talk about is why are these motions set? So why do CA teams tend to come up with these motions and they want to have them, besides the fact that they think they are fun? So the first reason is that they want to use the CA fiat. So what this means is that often CAs have a real world motion idea, but the problem with it is that there is the implementation that would happen in the real world would ruin the debate. So they use kind of magic or like magical technology that fixes it and kind of overcomes those implementation problems. So to explain what we mean by this, if it's too abstract, an example of this is the motion that was at Astana Euros this year. And the motion read, given the technology, this house would erase society's memory and evidence of the criminal past of former convicts after release from prison. To make it interactive, if people want to type in a chat or unmute themselves, what would be, if you can think of wording or just an idea, what real world motion would have similar clashes? What do we think was the real world idea that was kind of magicked up through this motion? Please type so I'm not sad. Yeah? Yeah, so Olga is correct in the chat. So not giving people criminal records or something like deleting criminal records of former convicts. So this is an example of where obviously if the motion was Jesus Christ, Chris, if the motion was what Olga wrote in the chat, it would be probably quite hard to implement this, and teams would be making arguments about the problems of the implementation, why that would be problematic, etc., etc. If the CA team doesn't want to have those issues and want to overcome that, and they want to kind of just have that debate, the clash that they want to isolate in and of itself, they can use the sort of magical fiat to fix those implementation problems. Second reason is that CAs like some particular clash and they want to isolate their idea and they want to blow it up to a bigger proportion. So this can happen, for example, with ethics and principle debates. So often when you set a real world debate that has a clear principled clash, debaters who don't like principles are really, really good at kind of avoiding the principle and just talking about the consequential things around it. So if CA teams don't want that to happen, what they do instead is they come up with an hypothetical motion with some pill or something like that, that isolates that ethical clash, and you can't be making arguments that have to do with the real world consequences. But obviously, it's not just about principles, it can be about any other clash. So for example, sometimes there's problem with real world motions of not being really high impact. And so instead, I'm going to blow it up and try to make it high impact through some magical technology. So for example, if I want to have a debate about, I don't know, privacy, it might be the case that currently I do not have any technology that would allow me to have like a very big, high impact debate about limiting people's privacy. But I can come up with an experimental technology that is magical, that can make that clash very high impact. As a result, then the debate can become significantly more interesting. Other reasons is that sometimes CAs just have a fun idea that they saw in a movie, they saw it in a book or a TV show, and they're like, that's interesting, that could be a motion. Alternatively, a CA watched an episode of Black Mirror once. So Rhys wanted me to point out that the reason why we separated Black Mirror from fun idea from movie, book, and TV show is because Black Mirror is not fun and it's unoriginal. I have never seen Black Mirror, so I can't attest if it's true. But so don't boo at me, boo at Rhys. I said that I'm gonna say it because I was forced. Either way, so those are broadly the reasons as to why CA teams tend to set those motions. It's going to become important in a bit in terms of how you should be thinking about them when you're prepping them. So if I can get the next slide. Cool. Okay. So in terms of common mistakes, so there are two that we want to point out. So the first one is people tend to assume a lot more than what is written in the actual info slide. So it's like speakers standing up and they are like, we've all seen the movie, so let me dump a lot of spec without analyzing it. The implication of this is twofold. The first one is that people tend to skip analysis to back up otherwise plausible claims. So you just assert things because they were in the movie and you don't bother analyzing it. Or in the worst case, they assert things that are implausible if you just took the info slide into consideration. To make this clearer, there is an example of a motion that was at Imperial IV, the Euros prep a year ago. And the example reads, it had a long info slide. I'm going to read it just so if it's small, I think it's quite small. So if you can't read it, I read it for you. So the info slide reads, you are a middle-class young adult with a family and a stable job. You recently found out the world you live in is an augmented reality called the Matrix, controlled by AI, which has revolted against humans. The world outside is dominated by the hostile AI, but its power external to Matrix is limited by the physical reality. For example, it needs to physically find a person in order to locate them and needs to physically catch them to harm them. You are offered a red pill that will take you out of the Matrix into a real world and a blue pill that will make you forget the realization altogether and return to virtual life as though nothing happened. Either choice is irreversible and you only get one pill which can't be shared with others. And then the motion read that this house will take the blue pill over the red pill. What happened in some rooms, not in mine, that's my caveat because some people who were in my room are in this workshop, so I'm not atting them, it happened somewhere else. So the problems that happened in some rooms was that the teams on government, seeing this motion and being like, this is obviously about Matrix, would just not analyze why the outside world would probably be bad and would be kind of apocalyptic. So they would just assert it. Obviously, this is a plausible claim and it's easy to analyze and give structural reasons for it. But often teams just skip it because they are like, we've all seen it. This is going to be like correct. But again, it's very easy, for example, for your closing to just stand up and analyze it for you in case you just skip it and assert it. The worst thing that happens is that in some op teams would assume things like the presence of a potentially successful resistance movement. So that is obviously a problem because nothing in the info slide, if you look at it again, says that there is any resistance movement. So if you just stand up and say like, obviously there is one, and Gov is like, no, there's not because the info slide doesn't give any reasons for it, you are kind of screwed. And a lot of the arguments that you are going to be making on that basis are going to fall out. So what is the important thing then is to make sure you read the info slide. This is not to say if you saw the movie that it is based on, you can't use the spec that you have, but you need to make sure that you are treating it in the way that you would treat any other motion, like for example, IR motions. You always need to give structural reasons as to why the characterization and the facts that you are claiming are likely to be true. Usually, if you saw the film, there is some reasons as to why the film is the way it is. So you can give those and make your analysis significantly more nuanced. But again, problem is when people just stand up and assert things without backing them up. The second thing is that this house prefers a world motions, which a lot of these hypothetical motions are, involve the world changing in quite a drastic way. So, for example, the way that people will respond to things is different than if the motion would just come into effect tomorrow. So again, to make it clearer, an example of this is a motion, this house prefers a world with a norm of radical honesty. So what that means is like people just wouldn't be lying to you, wouldn't be giving the white lies that like we are used to saying. Like instead of people telling you that like you look pretty in whatever you're wearing, they would just be like, no, this looks bad on you. And similar things. So the op claim that ops sometimes make if they don't think about emotion enough is to say things like, but people are going to get like really offended because of this and they're going to be really sad. Now, the issue with that is that if you think of how the world would probably look like had this been the norm since ever, it is unlikely that people would get offended. The reason being that people would probably get socialized in a way that they would expect that behavior from others. So the reason why I probably get offended if someone doesn't give me the white lie right now is because I expect the white lies, the way I'm socialized, the way I respond to these things, the way I do it for other people as well. If the norm is that everyone is radically honest, it is unclear why people are going to get so offended if it's just the norm, the way people do it. So always think of, how does the motion affect the world? What all the things that change in terms of socialization, in terms of how people respond, how people engage with the new thing that you are adding in. So if that's all clear, I'm just going to check the chat if there's anything that is not booing at Rhys because of Black Mirror. Okay, no questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop it in the chat. Otherwise, I'm just gonna move on to the next slide. So in terms of general advice, there are going to be 3 parts of it, but just starting with the first one. So the first advice is just to not panic. So often what teams do is when they see a hypothetical motion, some weird technology, long ass info slide, they start panicking because it's something that they didn't think of. Usually, if you have your stock arguments from other debates, they will be applicable. You just need to adapt your analysis on the specific context. So again, given that we explained that a lot of these motions is just a normal clash blown up to in proportion, or it's an isolated idea or something of that sort, you can just identify what that thing is, identify it in prep, and then you can use a lot of arguments that you already know and just adapt it to the particular context. And yeah, I actually said this, the second point. I'm efficient. Third one is, again, try to think of other ways in which the world changes. So this is particularly helpful when you're thinking about depth in bag halves. So sometimes there are very obvious arguments that is likely going to be taken by OG and OO, but any radical change in terms of adding a new big technology that changes, like everyone has implanted in them or something of that sort, changes a huge amount about the world that is outside of just that technology. So you, if you have time to think of how the world has changed, as a result of this, you can find a lot of extra material that you can exploit in bag half, which means that in most cases, and this is again a good reason to like these motions, they are not going to be shallow. They usually have a lot of depth, especially if you just think of the different layers in terms of how the world changes. So I think this is all in terms of my part. Just before I give it to Rhys, just in case this is the last training that we are running, thanks a lot everyone who's been attending. If you attended like this time for the first time, or if you've been here from term 1, I'm very happy about how it turned out. We thought it's going to be a small group of NAMDA people, and it became very international, and it was very nice. So yeah, maybe we'll be back if we come up with topics, but otherwise, thanks a lot everyone for supporting it, and I'll give it to Rhys.
Wonderful. Okay, in that case, I'm going to continue with our 3 sections on general advice. So the next thing I want to talk about is a way of generating material in prep time on these kind of hypothetical motions. In particular, I think one of the things in hypothetical motions that you need to be able to do to access material is just to ask yourself the characterization type questions. What is it that the world and the way that you're using this technology or this magic or whatever it is likely to look like? And doing so is going to often give you access quite quickly to a lot of potential ideas for cases. So we've listed here a couple of questions that I think it's often useful to answer in prep time. So let me just run through those. So the first question I'll often ask myself on any technology or hypothetical motion is, how is this technology or phenomenon used, and who has access to it? Secondly, how is it that people are likely to think about that technology or that phenomenon? Thirdly, how do people experience the application of that technology? Obviously, these questions are a little abstract. So what I want to do for the majority of this slide is actually work through a kind of worked example and how we might answer these questions, and therefore how we might be able to generate cases from them. So this is a motion I set a little while back at a competition. I'll read the info slide again for people who might have it a little small on their screens. So the info slide reads, The emote is a hypothetical wearable technology that reports the levels of any given emotion that the wearer is experiencing and gives them the ability to temporarily prevent themselves from experiencing that emotion. Once an emotion has been dulled, it is stored and must be released by the user within the next 24 hours, at which point they will experience all of the stored emotions over a period of 10 minutes. And then the motion reads, this house prefers a world in which the emote exists and is widely available. So what I want to do is first talk through how you might answer, Tom, please don't say this would make a cool episode of Black Mirror. That hurts my soul. So what I want to do first is talk through how you might answer these questions in prep time and where they might lead you. And then at the end, I want to illustrate how this might hypothetically lead to an addition of depth in back half that would allow you to come to useful cases. So let's run through the questions first. So the first question is, well, the question I want to answer first is at least who has access to the technology. This one is easy. It says so in the motion. The technology is widely available. And so you should assume the answer to that question is pretty much everyone. The more interesting question might be, how is the technology used? And I think once you start asking yourself that question, there are a couple of situations that might come to mind. For example, it might be the case that you want to remove negative emotions at times where it's inconvenient for you to experience them and store them until later. So for example, I don't know, if you're nervous in a job interview or you're angry in a social situation or whatever. It might also be the case, though, that you want to save positive emotions up until the end of the day to experience them all in one short burst. Once you've started to answer that question, then I think hopefully people can already see there might be lots of cases that start to stem from how this means social situations change, how it is that people are expected to behave, and so on. The second question is then, how do people think about the use of that technology? So in this instance, the answer to this question might lead you to realize that a world in which the emote is widely available might be one in which there is an expectation that you use it in certain circumstances, because people have normalized the idea that people can dull their emotions, and therefore emotional responses are something that are no longer things you don't have control over. And again, I think you can therefore start to generate cases based on this observation. Finally, the question, how do people experience the application of the technology or its use? And this is where I think I want to, in my hypothetical debate, so hypothetical not meaning just the motion, but also I'm going to make up a top half, illustrate a way that back half might be able to come to depth if top half haven't had time to answer all of these questions. For example, a very plausible way that this debate might go in top half is that top half discuss what emotions you might cause, how this might improve your ability to interact in certain social situations, or what expectations might come of you. I think one of the things that you might be able to say in back half then is, for example, if you were closing opposition, you might be able to describe why the experience of this technology, why having such an intense burst of emotions where everything is stored up and then pushed into just 10 minutes is likely to be incredibly overwhelming and exhausting. Why this might be a world you might observe then where lots of people use this technology on a regular basis and they're expected to use it. And at this point, I genuinely think, for example, you might start to feel that this world becomes a bit dystopian. Maybe corporations, for example, expect you to not be emotional at work and you end up burning yourself out at home as a result. And I think this observation then has allowed me to generate, I think, quite a few different cases, for example, on opposition. Equally, on government, one might be able to flip this and say that people are likely to be experiencing that burnout anyway, and at least now they're able to prepare for that release and maybe do so in a supportive environment. Again, then there's an inverse of that claim based on how people plan to experience the application of the technology. Hopefully that makes it clear then how I'm using this set of questions in order to firstly understand emotion, which I think is the crucial thing often to do in back half in hypothetical motions. Just ask yourself lots of questions that are going to allow you to understand the world so that you can fill in the key missing links that come in top half, that are also allowing me to generate a wider range of cases so that I'm probably going to have some horizontal depth as well over my top half teams, which is almost always the case that kind of extension is available to you in such motions simply because the impacts are so high. So there is a question in the chat. I'm going to come back to that, I think, at the end of the workshop, because I think that would fit best most in the Q&A session. So if I forget that question, please just drop me a reminder at the end. Otherwise, I want to move on to our final slide of general advice. Three other things that I think it is useful to do in to consider in prep time in order to generate more argumentation. Firstly, often just reality checking your argument generation can be incredibly useful. I think that's something that often happens in hypothetical motions, is that teams get caught up in the kind of, I want to say, magic of the technology or whatever condition or phenomenon they're talking about, and get lost going for the kind of large impacts that they think they can build a logical chain through, and forget the very real world ways in which that phenomenon might play out. I think this is best seen through an example. So this is a motion that was set in Outrounds at Oxford IV. I'll read again the info slide. So hypothymesia is a rare condition that leads people to be able to remember an abnormally large number of their life experiences in vivid detail. The motion then reads, this house would prefer to be born with hypothymesia. So I think there's lots of cases that talk about the individual experience, whether that might be good or bad for you. And there is a tendency, I think, for teams on this motion to start to zoom in on that particular aspect of the debate, because it's maybe the most obvious one where you can generate cases. One of the ways, though, I think you can do very well in this debate in opposition, and that happened in at least one room at Oxford IV on this, is just to think about what the real world outcomes for someone with this condition might be. That is, you are immensely different to the people around you in the way that you perceive the world. And that means you're probably going to be quite unpopular. You're likely to remember lots of things that other people don't remember about their lives, and probably have an impetus, therefore, to constantly remind those people of those things. Equally, other people are likely to be frustrating for you because they regularly forget details that are clear, and your expectations of how they might behave then are going to be different. Ultimately, you might end up basically seeming like a bit of a dick because other people have different expectations of you than you have of them. This is, I think, not necessarily the most obvious impact of the info slide when you read it. It does, however, I think, become a lot clearer once you just start to think about what the plausible ways that people would actually interact with this phenomenon are. How would real world people actually respond to it? Secondly, in terms of argument generation, a note on this house prefers a world motions in particular. So often you'll be debating, when it's a hypothetical motion, a motion that might be of the form, this house prefers a world where some technology exists. Those worlds aren't just ones in which this technology is dropped tomorrow. We already mentioned this to some extent in the common mistakes section when we talked about the social norms in such worlds changing. But it's also the fact that societies themselves, for example, might be structured completely differently in such a world. To illustrate this, consider the example, this house prefers a world where people cannot lie. So there's, I think, a relatively well-known case on this motion by now in opposition that talks about why lying might actually itself be crucial in order to build and structure societies, why the initial foundation of society is contingent on people being able to lie to each other about the risk they feel and the trust that they have for each other, and why without that, society in of itself in the first place might not form, and why this therefore might be a much worse world. This is, I think, something that goes beyond the obvious initial effects of this motion and only becomes clear once you ask yourself the questions of how the world at a macro level starts to change, or how it might look different, especially remembering that this house prefers of world motions are ones that stretch back historically. The final piece of advice general advice I want to give in terms of case generation, rather, is that sometimes CAs do mess up when setting these motions. For example, the common way this happens is that they don't write enough in the info slide to clearly specify the debate they had in mind. This is something that's quite easy to do because you might have a particular conception of what the world looks like. You write an info slide and you think you've captured that conception, but of course not all of the details are necessarily there. What that means is that it's sometimes the case that you can just break these motions by exploiting exactly what is written in the info slide and what is not written in the info slide. That means you shouldn't be worried if you think that that's something that's happened, that you must automatically be incorrect because the CA team are perfect. CA teams do make mistakes on these motions. And if you're in a situation to, please do exploit them so that CA teams in future spend more time crafting info slides carefully. That's it for general advice. At this point, I want to pause and ask if there are any questions. I will come back to that question I promised to in the Q&A at the end, because before that, we do have an exercise for you all. But are there any questions about this slide? So there's a question about the example. This is something that would be up to the CA team to answer. So the question is, in the this house prefers a world where people cannot lie motion, what about lying to yourself? Is that included? Obviously, this is the kind of thing that might be a good idea to put in an online competition in the CA questions chat on Discord, if that's the platform you're using in person, to just ask the CAs in the announcement hall. This does lead me to one general piece of advice, though, that if you have such questions, absolutely asking clarifications from the CA team is the way to go early on. Often things aren't specified, and you do want to just ask lots of those questions in order to get those details. If I had to answer in this motion, I would assume that lying to yourself would not be included, and that this motion applies to the capacity to lie via the spoken word or something, i.e. to just say sentences that are untruths. Obviously, though, that would be a question that you shouldn't take the answer to from me if you see this motion in future, but rather you should clarify with the particular CA team at the tournament you're at. Are there any other questions about this slide? Okay. If not, I believe next we are going to the exercise. So hopefully Lucie has some breakout rooms ready to sort people into. We're going to be putting you on an exercise in a second. So we've got another hypothetical motion for you. So I'll read the info slide. The empathic field aperture, or EPA, is a neural implant which causes recipients to experience an accurate, though somewhat reduced, sense of the emotional state of anyone they are in contact with. And the motion will read, this house prefers a world where everyone is implanted with the EPA device at birth. So for those of you who are at KCL Pro-Am, this is another motion. I was on the CA team there that we set this for the various finals. What we'd like to do then is have you go into breakout rooms that Lucie will assign you to in a second. I think Lucie will also be able to tell you who's running those rooms and who's going to be Gov, who's going to be Op. But we'd like you to apply the various pieces of advice we've given you in terms of case generation, in terms of the common pitfalls that you might fall into, and spend some time trying to generate cases on this motion. Once you've had some time, we're going to come back. We're going to ask the people running the room to relay some of your thoughts to us, and we're going to have a discussion based on what you all have come up with. So Lucie, do we have breakout rooms?
Yeah,
ready?
So we have breakout rooms. So we all have 2 breakout rooms. One is going to be run by Kat and one is going to be run by Trinu. So the Kat one, if you can do the op case, and the Trinu one, if you can make the gov case. We're going to give you, I guess we can give up to 20 minutes. If you need more, like if you two can text me and then we can extend it. So I'm going to open the breakout room.
Lucie, no, please don't open the breakout rooms quite yet. There is a clarifying question on the info slide in the chat. I need to be able to answer these before we open. Sorry. So yeah, if anyone else has clarifying questions, Dino has done the right thing and started asking the CA team quickly. If anyone else has them, please also post them in the chat. So Dino's question was, what does contact mean in this context? Say if this workshop were physical right now, would I be in contact with all of you? Yeah, so it means within close physical proximity, but obviously via Zoom wouldn't count, via phone call, and so on. Kat, I believe you're going to be opposition.
Yep.
Are there ways to turn it off? No, Olga.
Okay, so now if I can open the breakout rooms, cool.
Yep, if no one else has questions. If you do have questions that come up.
We want to like paste, I might want to paste it to the chat.
Yeah, I will paste it to the Discord and ask anything once the breakout rooms are open. If you then have any more questions that are clarifications about the motion that come up while you're thinking about it, also drop them and ask anything, and I'll be monitoring that to answer those. Okay. Okay, if we can open breakout rooms.
Yep, they open now.
If everyone is back, then we'll start having a chat about what you've been thinking about. So the natural place to start, I suppose, would seem to be the government room. Trinu, I believe that was your room. Do you want to tell us what kind of things you were discussing?
Yeah, 1 sec. Okay. So I'll just give quite a brief overview because I'm not going to be able to convey 20 minutes of discussion. I think that overall we came to a couple of conclusions. Firstly, in Gov, it is important to do the characterization on like how this word looks like. Firstly, an important piece of framing for most arguments is like why empathy is something that is unique in terms of communications and how that is something that changes, i.e. how conveying emotions in the status quo is something that is hard. and like why that's the necessary thing. I think also probably in the beginning it's important in Gov to do stuff that mitigates obvious claims, like stuff about being overwhelmed by emotions and how people on this world will probably be used to it. And like even if on this side people are able to if people decide to not care about things at all, it is comparatively still higher because you're still exposed to all of those emotions. So we came to like two broad argumentation lines on how this is going to change. Firstly, in terms of how it changes in individual relationships or individual interactions that people have as on a personal level. So firstly, in terms of how relationships overall can be stronger or more genuine as they come from basis of more accurate emotions, as this is something that this policy, this thing creates. And then lots of other types of impacts in terms of like either people are more prone to things like apologizing more if you make someone angry, or more able to help people who are like, I don't know, depressed. And second most important thing probably is that you're less likely to hurt other people because the pain you would cause on others is likely to cause pain on you. And this has lots of impacts in terms of less people being hurt. And the second broad category of impacts is like in terms of social structures. I think the overall theme here is that all of the like societies or social structures that we have are much more likely to be built more empathetically, because you're much more likely to experience what other people around you are experiencing in that society. And that is something that is likely to help in all areas, whether it's like economic terms, you're more likely to end in socialism, or you have like a better legal system, or you have a system that is more accepting towards minorities or people with different abilities. And so in that sense, you're much more likely to also achieve that through like some mechanisms on activism, but I don't think I should go into that.
Wonderful, thanks, Trini. Next then we'll hear what the op room came up with, and then maybe we'll have a chat about how it all fits together. So Kat, you have the op room.
Yep. I think we broadly start on how people socialize differently and like are initially socialized as a result of the fact that they're exposed to emotions of people around them, this broadly centering around two strands. One, at the point where someone around you even just as a child, where your like decision-making calculus is likely to be relatively simplistic based on I do things that make me happy and I don't do things that make me sad. You try to be around people who are happy, you avoid people who are sad, because it is a surer way to avoid people who are sad than to try to comfort them, because comforting people is quite difficult to do. Avoiding people is significantly easier and significantly more certain. Secondly, people who are feeling sad are aware of the fact that this has an effect on other people, which means they either try to hide this or try to like distract themselves from it, or try to avoid people themselves, which means they are more likely to like experience isolation as a result. And therefore not resolve their problems. Secondly, even to the degree that you do interact with people who are feeling badly because you cannot avoid it, you are more likely to try and respond to this in a manner that immediately resolves it, as opposed to addressing the overarching concern, because you now experience temporally, the longer that they feel bad in your presence, the more bad you feel, as opposed to when you don't necessarily have to feel bad for them and you can feel more joy at the eventual resolution of it, even at the point where this maybe took longer of them feeling bad, which means that you're more likely to say, talk their emotions through with them as opposed to distract them, which is more likely to yield effective resolution. Sort of stretching this out a little bit further, this is likely to lead to people forming fewer deep friendships because they perceive every interaction as being relatively riskier, because they think that it is likelier that other people will run away from it at the point where things are not going well, because they are less likely to be able to be empowered to hide that from them or to minimize the degree to which that other person is affected by it. But secondly, it also makes it less special when you share something with someone, because that's just the default, which means you assign less value to those deeper interactions that you have and are therefore less likely to build on them. Therefore, worse support systems, more isolation, which presumably is something that is quite bad. Lastly, I think that we arrive at sort of like an assorted set of claims on why, generally speaking, this is damaging to the degree that you otherwise could be able to effectively interact with people and seek help for your claims. I think this is probably the space where we spend least time, but basically that we, generally speaking, are able to seek help from people that we value because we do understand our own emotions to some degree. I think probably this is something that on Opt you would have to prove with significantly more time than we devoted to it, on like why people can access and communicate their own emotions to the degree that they would be able to effectively get help, relative to the like various isolating experiences that we flag might be the case on Gov, but we didn't devote that much time to it because it was more fun to talk about socialization.
Okay, thanks, both of you. I think there's a couple of comments I'd make. So first, I think both sides do a very good job actually of applying the advice we gave in the workshop and running through those questions. I'm really happy with how that turned out. I think there are a couple of phenomena that are kind of coming out of these two prep sessions that I think are useful pieces of advice. Firstly, I think it was realized already right at the start of Gov and also in OP that often characterization in these debates, as well as in general debates, but especially in hypothetical motions, are a really good way to have a stake in analysis later in the debate. That is, lots of the analysis is going to depend on characterization of exactly how that world or technology looks. And in particular, then, doing that characterization early is a really good way of trying to be relevant in top half to the back half of the room, and something that I think both teams do a good job of thinking about, and definitely something that's worth thinking about early. The second thing, though, that I think I notice here is that characterization is starting to actually become a core clash in this debate. And I think that happens a lot more in hypothetical motions. So, for example, one of the clashes that ends up happening about individual relationships is whether you are more likely to help others or you're more likely to distance yourselves from them because you're trying to be around people who are happy. One of the core questions that I think might well resolve this then is how effectively you can distance yourselves from people who are unhappy, or whether it is likely that you're going to be interacting with these people anyway, and therefore have an impetus to help them in order to avoid that experience. And that means that once you start to think about how the analysis is playing out on either side, characterization becomes the core question that's going to resolve which bench is winning that clash. And so I think that's something that's useful to be aware of as the debate unfolds. Otherwise, I think that's all of the comments I make about this exercise. Other than I think I'm genuinely impressed with how people did on it. There were some questions earlier that I promised to come back to. As usual, we will end this workshop with a Q&A before we go to the SPA debate that we're having afterwards. Let me just reopen the chat. So there was one question I promised to come back to earlier. I'm going to find that. Otherwise, whilst I'm finding an answer in that, if you have any other general questions about kind of hypothetical motions, please feel free to drop those into the chat and I'll do my best to answer them. The question that I was asked to come back to earlier is, I find it hard to analyze questions like the intensity of emotions, as it seems very dependent on the individual. Do you have any advice for that? I think the advice I would give is that analyzing these kinds of claims often just involves trying to be as descriptive as you can about how it is that emotion might feel. Obviously, that is something that is to some extent personal, but often when you give good descriptions of what that feels like, this is something that will resonate with judges and their own experience to some extent, and they will interpret it through the lens of their own experience. So, for example, I think just describing via intuition pump in the instance I was talking about earlier with the emote and having exhaustion after the intensity of emotion, how tired it is people feel after they've had an incredibly emotionally intense day, why that day has then why those emotions have spent lots of time on their mind and mean that their brain has been overworked and they're likely to be incredibly tired at the end of it, and trying to do that in an incredibly descriptive way. It is the best way to make that analysis. Obviously, the thing you're relying on here is that the judges are able to interpret the way that they feel those emotions in your description. But given that that is very likely to happen, this ends up, I think, usually being an effective strategy. Hopefully that's somewhat of an answer to that question. Beyond that, I think this is a question in just individual actor analysis. We have some more advice on that in a workshop, but I think is more of a skill than I can go into too deeply in a Q&A at the end of this one. Are there any other questions anyone has about anything in this workshop, about hypothetical motions, that they'd like me to have a crack at answering now?